The auction hammer fell with a sharp crack that echoed across the dusty fairgrounds of Cedar Falls, Montana, sealing a bargain that would alter the course of 3 lives forever. Rebecca Hayes stood at the edge of the crowd, her hand resting protectively over the gentle swell beneath her worn cotton dress, watching as the auctioneer's assistant led a limping man and his equally wounded horse toward her with expressions that mixed gratitude and bewilderment in equal measure. She had just purchased a human being and his mount for the price of a decent milk cow, though the law called it something different: settling a debt, claiming an indenture, buying a work contract. The terminology mattered little to Rebecca. What mattered was the desperate calculation that had driven her to raise her bidding paddle when every rational thought screamed against such reckless spending. The injured cowboy moved with the careful precision of someone intimately acquainted with pain, favoring his left leg while maintaining a dignity that no amount of misfortune could diminish. His horse, a magnificent chestnut stallion with intelligent eyes and a spirit that even injury couldn't break, limped beside him with the kind of trust that spoke of bonds forged through shared hardship neither the man nor the woman could have imagined as they faced each other across that dusty Montana fairground in the autumn of 1887. That this moment of desperation would become the foundation for something far greater than either had dared to hope for in their darkest hours. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Montana Territory stretched endless and unforgiving beneath a September sky that promised early frost, its vastness broken only by the thin ribbon of smoke rising from Rebecca Hayes' modest homestead. 26 years old and 6 months pregnant, she stood at her kitchen window watching the horizon with the particular intensity of someone who had learned that survival depended on reading every subtle change in weather, terrain, and circumstance. Her calloused hands moved automatically through the morning routine of stoking the fire in her wood-burning stove, the motions refined through 18 months of solitary practice since cholera had claimed her husband, David, leaving her alone on 160 acres of claim land that seemed determined to test every ounce of determination she possessed. The baby kicked against her ribs as if sensing her contemplation, a reminder that solitude was a luxury she could no longer afford. David Hayes had been a dreamer wrapped in practical clothing, a man who could envision golden wheat fields where others saw only prairie grass and scattered stone. He'd convinced Rebecca to leave the relative comfort of her family's farm in Ohio, to chase promises of free land and unlimited opportunity under the Homestead Act. Their first year had been brutal but hopeful, marked by the kind of shared struggle that either destroys marriages or forges them into something unbreakable. The cabin David had built with his own bleeding hands still bore evidence of his craftsmanship. In every carefully chinked log and precisely fitted joint, he'd constructed it to withstand Montana's legendary winters, with thick walls and a stone foundation that would outlast lesser structures by decades. But all his careful planning couldn't protect against the invisible enemy that had swept through the territory like wildfire, claiming settlers regardless of their preparation or determination. Rebecca had nursed David through the fever and delirium, melting snow for water when their well froze, burning furniture when firewood ran low, watching helplessly as the disease hollowed him out from within. His death had come mercifully quick at the end, but the aftermath had stretched into months of grinding solitude that tested her sanity as thoroughly as her survival skills. The land itself seemed to conspire against single homesteaders, demanding constant attention to livestock, crops, repairs, and the 1,000 daily tasks that had been manageable for 2 people, but felt overwhelming for one pregnant woman working alone. Rebecca had learned to shoe horses, mend harnesses, diagnose cattle ailments, and perform countless other jobs that frontier wives typically left to their husbands. Her nearest neighbors, the Patterson family, lived 12 miles south across terrain that could become impassable during severe weather. John and Mary Patterson had been kind during the worst of her grief, bringing food and offering assistance with heavy labor. But their own struggles with drought and grasshopper infestations had gradually reduced their visits to occasional encounters. At the monthly supply runs to Cedar Falls, the isolation had taken on a weight of its own, pressing against Rebecca's shoulders like an invisible burden that grew heavier with each passing day. Conversation became a luxury she experienced only during trips to town, where the general store proprietor and his wife treated her with the careful kindness reserved for those whose circumstances inspired both sympathy and nervous gratitude. That such misfortune had befallen someone else, Rebecca's pregnancy had been a surprise that transformed grief into something more complex, a mixture of joy, terror, and desperate determination that kept her moving when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her completely. The baby would arrive in late February or early March, during the harshest part of Montana's winter, when travel to town might be impossible and medical assistance beyond reach. She had delivered calves and foals, assisted with difficult births among her livestock, but human childbirth remained a mystery that filled her dreams with anxieties she couldn't voice to anyone. The frontier medical knowledge she'd absorbed through necessity seemed inadequate for the challenges she would face alone in a cabin miles from help. Financial pressures added another layer of stress to her already overwhelming circumstances. David's death had interrupted their careful plans for expanding the homestead's productivity, leaving projects half-finished and debts partially paid. The general store extended credit based on future crop sales, but poor weather had reduced their harvest to barely enough for personal consumption, let alone commercial sale. Rebecca's careful accounting revealed a stark truth. Without additional income, she would exhaust her limited savings before spring planting, leaving her unable to purchase seed, unable to maintain her livestock, and unable to prove up on their homestead claim. The land that had represented hope and opportunity was becoming a trap that might cost her everything. David had died believing in the territorial government's homestead requirements, demanded continuous occupation and agricultural improvement, standards that became increasingly difficult to meet as a single pregnant woman with limited resources. Abandoning the claim would mean losing everything they had invested, but staying might mean risking her life and her unborn child's future. Sleep had become elusive, interrupted by the baby's movements and her own churning thoughts about impossible choices and inadequate options. She would lie awake listening to the wind test the cabin's defenses, calculating and recalculating her resources, searching for solutions that consistently remained beyond reach. The livestock required daily attention regardless of weather or her physical condition. 6 chickens, 2 milk cows, 3 horses, and a small herd of cattle that represented most of their invested capital. Each animal demanded feeding, watering, medical care when sick, and protection from predators that ranged from coyotes to mountain lions. Rebecca had learned to work efficiently despite her expanding waistline, but she recognized that her capabilities would diminish significantly as her pregnancy progressed. David's tools and equipment lay scattered around the property in various states of completion and repair. A half-built barn that needed finishing before winter's worst weather arrived. Fencing that required constant maintenance to contain livestock and protect gardens from wild animals. Harnesses and machinery that demanded regular care to prevent costly breakdowns during critical seasons. The vegetable garden that had provided much of their food was showing signs of neglect, despite Rebecca's best efforts. Weeds flourished while vegetables struggled, the endless cycle of hoeing, watering, and harvesting becoming increasingly difficult as her mobility decreased. She had preserved what she could, but the root cellar that should have been full of winter supplies remained only partially stocked. Reading had become her primary escape from the relentless pressure of daily survival. David's small collection of books included agricultural manuals, a few novels, and several volumes of poetry that helped fill the crushing silence of evening hours. She read aloud to the baby, imagining that her voice might somehow reach the child growing within her, providing comfort and connection across the mysterious boundary between them. The mirror above her washstand reflected a woman she sometimes didn't recognize. Months of outdoor labor had weathered her skin and strengthened her hands, while pregnancy had softened her features and added curves that reminded her constantly of the life developing within. Her light brown hair, once carefully arranged, now stayed pinned in practical styles that could withstand wind and work. Letters from her family in Ohio arrived sporadically, carried by freight wagons and circuit riders whose schedules depended on weather and demand. Her mother's careful script conveyed love and worry in equal measure, along with gentle suggestions that Rebecca might consider returning home where family support could ease the burdens of single motherhood. But accepting such charity would mean admitting defeat, abandoning everything she and David had sacrificed to achieve. The territorial newspaper, when she could obtain copies, painted an increasingly complex picture of the region's development. Railroad construction was bringing new settlers and commercial opportunities, but also competition for resources and markets that made small homesteads less viable. Mining discoveries were creating boomtowns overnight while exhausted claims became ghost towns just as quickly. Rebecca's educated background set her apart from many frontier women, a distinction that could be both advantage and liability depending on circumstances. She could read agricultural reports and market analyses that helped inform her decisions, but she also understood more clearly than less educated neighbors exactly how precarious her situation had become. The approaching winter represented a deadline that grew more ominous with each shortening day. Firewood needed splitting and stacking, buildings required weatherproofing, and food stores demanded expansion if she hoped to survive the months when travel might be impossible. Each task seemed to multiply into dozens of subtasks that overwhelmed her planning abilities, but it was the prospect of giving birth alone that filled her with the deepest dread. She had studied every medical text available, memorized procedures and potential complications, prepared supplies and contingency plans. Yet the knowledge only heightened her awareness of everything that could go wrong without assistance, without experienced hands to help if complications arose. The cattle auction in Cedar Falls represented her last hope for raising the capital needed to survive the winter and prepare for spring. She had identified several young steers whose sale would provide enough money to purchase essential supplies, pay outstanding debts, and create a small reserve for emergencies. But driving cattle to market alone, in her condition, presented risks that made the enterprise barely less dangerous than doing nothing. As September's warmth faded into October's chill, Rebecca faced the reality that time was running out for half measures and cautious decisions. The choices she made in the coming weeks would determine not just her own survival, but the future of the child she carried and the homestead that represented everything she and David had dreamed of building together. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The morning Rebecca decided to drive her cattle to market dawned gray and bitter, with frost coating the prairie grass like scattered diamonds and her breath forming small clouds in the crisp October air. She had spent 3 sleepless nights wrestling with the decision, weighing risks that seemed to multiply each time she examined them from a different angle. The baby had been unusually active during those dark hours, as if sensing her agitation and responding with restless movements. That made rest impossible. Standing in her barn before sunrise, Rebecca methodically checked and double-checked the gear she would need for the 30-mile journey to Cedar Falls. The worn leather saddle that had belonged to David, now adjusted with extra padding to accommodate her changing body. Saddlebags packed with jerky, hardtack, and a water canteen that might mean the difference between success and disaster if anything went wrong along the trail. Her 3 steers represented 18 months of careful breeding and feeding animals. She had nursed through illness and protected from predators with the dedication of someone who understood that each head of cattle was a tangible piece of her future. They were young but healthy, well-formed beasts that should bring fair prices if the market was favorable, and if she could get them to town without incident. The decision to undertake this journey alone violated every principle of frontier wisdom. She had learned. Pregnant women didn't drive cattle across open territory, especially not in October when weather could turn deadly without warning. Single riders didn't travel isolated trails where mechanical problems, injuries, or encounters with hostile wildlife could prove fatal. Desperate people sometimes ignored such wisdom, and Rebecca had definitely qualified as desperate. Her horse, a sturdy mare named Belle, had belonged to David and still showed signs of missing her original owner. The animal had required patient retraining to accept Rebecca's lighter touch and different riding style, but had proven reliable during shorter journeys around the homestead. Belle's familiarity with cattle work would be essential for managing the steers during the drive, assuming Rebecca's expanding waistline didn't interfere with her ability to handle the physical demands of herding. The route to Cedar Falls followed established cattle trails for most of the distance, winding through valleys that provided natural windbreaks and following creek beds that ensured adequate water for both livestock and rider. But several sections required crossing open prairie, where exposure to weather and visibility to potential threats made travel particularly hazardous. Rebecca had studied every mile of the journey, memorizing landmarks and identifying emergency shelters in case circumstances forced her to stop overnight. Weather forecasts, such as they were in 1887 Montana, suggested clear skies for the next few days, but Rebecca understood that prairie weather could change with devastating speed. She carried extra clothing, a waterproof tarp, and supplies for making emergency camp, though she fervently hoped circumstances wouldn't require such measures. Her pregnancy made sleeping outdoors not just uncomfortable but potentially dangerous. The steers proved surprisingly cooperative during the early miles, perhaps sensing the change in routine and responding to Belle's experienced guidance. Rebecca found herself settling into the rhythm of cattle driving, using techniques David had taught her during their brief time together. Her body protested the unaccustomed exertion, but adrenaline and determination overrode discomfort as the homestead disappeared behind rolling hills. The first 8 miles passed without incident, bringing them to Miller's Creek, where she allowed the cattle to drink while resting in the saddle and calculating their progress. The steers would need regular water stops, which would slow their overall pace, but was essential for maintaining their condition and market value. Dehydrated cattle brought significantly lower prices, assuming they survived the journey at all. As the morning progressed into afternoon, Rebecca encountered her first serious challenge when the steers spooked at something invisible to her eyes but clearly threatening to their primitive instincts. The lead steer, a particularly strong-willed animal she had named Goliath, suddenly bolted toward a stand of cottonwoods, followed immediately by his companions in the kind of panicked flight that could scatter the herd across miles of terrain. Responded magnificently to Rebecca's urgent guidance, cutting across the steer's path and using her size and training to gradually turn them back toward the trail. But the effort required riding at speeds that made Rebecca acutely aware of the risks she was taking, both for herself and her unborn child. The pounding rhythm of Belle's gallop seemed to echo the rapid beating of her heart as she fought to maintain control over animals that outweighed her horse by several hundred pounds each. The incident highlighted the precarious nature of her entire enterprise. A pregnant woman alone on the prairie with 3 half-ton animals possessed only the illusion of control, dependent on the cooperation of beasts that could kill her accidentally through simple panic. But turning back now would mean accepting financial ruin and the loss of everything she and David had worked to achieve. By midday, they had covered 15 miles and reached the halfway point of their journey. The steers had settled back into their traveling rhythm, apparently satisfied that whatever had frightened them no longer posed a threat. Rebecca allowed herself a brief meal of jerky and water while the cattle grazed on the abundant grass that grew near Willow Creek, one of the larger water sources along their route. The landscape around Willow Creek bore evidence of the heavy traffic that passed along the cattle trail. Dozens of fire rings marked previous camps, while worn paths led to the best water access points and sheltered areas. Rebecca observed fresh tracks from horses and cattle, indicating that other travelers had passed recently. Though she saw no signs of current human presence, the solitude that had oppressed her at the homestead felt different here in open country, less confining and more natural. The vast Montana sky stretched endlessly overhead, broken only by occasional clouds that cast moving shadows across the prairie. For the first time in months, Rebecca felt a sense of purpose that went beyond mere survival, a connection to the land and the life she was trying to build that reminded her why she and David had come west in the first place. But the afternoon brought new challenges as the weather began to shift in ways that made her increasingly nervous. The wind picked up from the northwest, carrying the scent of moisture and the peculiar pressure changes that often preceded autumn storms. The steers became restless, lifting their heads frequently to test the air and showing signs of the unease that often preceded bad weather. Rebecca's pregnancy made her acutely sensitive to barometric pressure changes, a phenomenon she had noticed, but not understood until David's death forced her to become her own weather predictor. The baby seemed to respond to approaching storms with increased activity, creating a reliable if uncomfortable early warning system. Today the movements were becoming more pronounced, suggesting that significant weather might be developing beyond. The northern horizon. The decision to push forward or seek shelter became more urgent as the afternoon wore on. Stopping now would mean losing valuable daylight and potentially spending the night exposed on open prairie if the weather deteriorated further. But continuing meant risking being caught in the open if a serious storm developed with no protection. For herself or the cattle, Rebecca chose to continue, driving the steers harder than she preferred while scanning the landscape for emergency shelter options. The trail wound through increasingly broken country where rocky outcroppings and stands of timber offered potential protection if circumstances became desperate. Her body protested the accelerated pace, but she recognized that reaching Cedar Falls before dark had become essential rather than merely preferable. The final 10 miles tested every skill she possessed as both rider and cattle handler. The steers sensed the approaching weather and became increasingly difficult to manage, wanting to seek shelter rather than continue along the exposed trail. Belle performed heroically, responding to Rebecca's guidance with the intelligence and training that marked her as one of David's best decisions. By late afternoon, the first drops of rain began falling, carried on gusts of wind that spoke of serious weather developing to the northwest. Rebecca wrapped herself in the oilcloth coat she had brought for such emergencies, but knew that prolonged exposure to cold rain could be dangerous for both her and the baby. The steers huddled together when she stopped them briefly, their instincts telling them to wait out the storm rather than continue traveling. But just as Rebecca began to seriously consider seeking emergency shelter, the outskirts of Cedar Falls appeared through the gray curtain of light rain. Smoke from dozens of chimneys rose into the cloudy sky, while the sound of human activity carried across the last mile of prairie. The cattle seemed to sense civilization ahead and picked up their pace voluntarily, eager to reach whatever shelter awaited them in town. The stockyards on Cedar Falls' western edge bustled with activity despite the deteriorating weather. Rebecca counted at least 50 head of cattle in the holding pens, along with several groups of horses and a small flock of sheep. Cowboys and ranchers moved through the maze of corrals with the efficient purpose of men conducting serious business, their voices carrying across the muddy ground as they evaluated livestock and negotiated prices. Rebecca's arrival with 3 steers drew immediate attention, not because of the animals but because of the obviously pregnant woman who had driven them to market alone. Conversations paused as curious eyes assessed her situation. probably wondering what combination of circumstances had forced such an unusual journey. She straightened in her saddle, meeting their stares with the dignity that frontier life had taught her was essential for earning respect. The stockyard manager, a weathered man named Tom Bradley, who had dealt with David on previous occasions, approached her with a mixture of concern and professional interest. His evaluation of her steers was thorough and fair, acknowledging their good condition while noting the slightly stressed appearance that resulted from their long drive. The price he quoted was lower than Rebecca had hoped, but higher than she had feared, enough to solve her immediate financial crisis if she could negotiate skillfully. As thunder rumbled overhead and the rain intensified, Rebecca realized that her gamble was about to pay off. The cattle were safely delivered, buyers were interested, and shelter was available for the night. But she also understood that tomorrow would bring new challenges, including the question of how a heavily pregnant woman was going to get herself safely home across 30 miles of potentially dangerous terrain. The stockyard held more than cattle that evening. It held the hopes and dreams of dozens of families whose futures depended on the prices their livestock would bring at tomorrow's auction. Rebecca settled her steers into a rented pen, arranged for feed and water, and paid for a room at the nearby boarding house where she could rest before facing whatever the morning would bring. Dawn broke clear and cold over Cedar Falls, the previous night's storm having passed through to leave the air crisp and sharp with the promise of autumn's quick advance toward winter. Rebecca woke in her narrow boarding house bed to the sound of cattle lowing in the stockyards and the voices of men already conducting the early business that preceded the formal auction. The baby kicked vigorously as she struggled to find a comfortable position, reminding her that time was advancing on multiple fronts. Mrs. Adelaide Morton, the boarding house proprietor, had proven unexpectedly kind the previous evening, offering Rebecca a hot meal and gentle conversation that eased some of the isolation she had endured for months. Adelaide was perhaps 50 years old, a widow herself who had learned to read the particular strain that marked women forced to navigate frontier life without male protection. Her establishment catered primarily to traveling cattlemen and merchants, but she maintained 2 rooms specifically for women who found themselves needing respectable accommodation in a rough frontier town. "You'll want to be at the auction early," Adelaide advised over breakfast of eggs, bacon, and coffee that Rebecca savored like a feast after months of simpler fare. "Tom Bradley runs an honest operation, but the buyers like to examine the livestock thoroughly before the bidding starts. Your steers are good animals, but presentation matters as much as quality when money's changing hands." The advice proved prescient when Rebecca made her way to the stockyards an hour before the scheduled auction. Buyers moved through the maze of pens with the systematic thoroughness of men whose livelihoods depended on accurate evaluation of livestock. They examined teeth and hooves, felt for muscle development and fat distribution, discussed bloodlines and breeding potential in the technical language of professional cattlemen. Rebecca positioned herself where she could observe the evaluation of her steers without appearing overeager or desperate, though both descriptions fit her circumstances perfectly. The animals looked good in the morning light, their coats glossy and their bearing alert despite the stress of yesterday's long drive. She had chosen well when selecting these particular animals for market, and their condition reflected the care she had invested in their development. But the auction yard held more than cattle. That morning, a separate section near the main building housed what the auction bills euphemistically called contract labor, men whose debts, legal troubles, or simple misfortune had reduced them to the status of indentured servants whose work contracts could be purchased by anyone willing to pay their obligations and assume responsibility for their welfare. Rebecca had heard of such arrangements, but never witnessed them firsthand. The practice skirted the edges of slavery laws while remaining technically legal, offering desperate men an alternative to debtor's prison while providing labor-hungry frontier operations with workers willing to accept harsh conditions in exchange for eventual freedom. The moral complexities made her uncomfortable, but frontier life rarely offered the luxury of pure ethical choices. The contract labor section drew fewer browsers than the livestock pens, probably because most potential buyers had specific needs and wouldn't consider human workers unless their circumstances were equally desperate. Rebecca found herself drawn to observe, despite her discomfort, partly from curiosity and partly from recognition that her own circumstances might not be so different from those of the men waiting to learn their fates. Among the dozen men awaiting auction, one figure commanded attention through the simple dignity of his bearing despite obvious physical distress. Tall and lean with dark hair and intelligent brown eyes, he carried himself with the unconscious pride of someone accustomed to controlling his own destiny. His left leg bore clear signs of serious injury, probably a break that had healed improperly, creating the pronounced limp that had likely contributed to his current predicament. Beside him stood a magnificent chestnut stallion whose condition mirrored his owner's, quality breeding and natural nobility struggling against the effects of hardship and injury. The horse's right foreleg showed signs of strain or old trauma, creating a matching pair of damaged but unbroken spirits, whose bond was evident in every glance and gesture between them. The auctioneer's assistant, a nervous young man named Billy Crawford, provided Rebecca with the background information that transformed curiosity into something approaching fascination. The injured man was called Jake Sullivan, a former cavalry officer who had purchased his discharge after sustaining wounds in conflicts with hostile tribes in the Dakota Territory. His horse, Thunder, had served with distinction in the same campaigns. Before injuries ended both their military careers. Came through here 3 weeks ago heading for California, Billy explained, clearly enjoying the opportunity to share gossip with an attractive woman. Had money then, enough to buy supplies and pay for proper veterinary care for that horse. But he got mixed up in a poker game with some professional gamblers passing through on the railroad. Lost everything, money, gear, even his saddle. When he couldn't pay his hotel bill and stable fees, Judge Morrison ruled he could work off the debt through contract labor. The story struck Rebecca with unexpected force, perhaps because it illustrated how quickly circumstances could destroy even careful plans and responsible people. Jake Sullivan had been a military officer, presumably educated and experienced in leadership, yet a single night of bad judgment had reduced him to this humiliating position. The parallels to her own situation were uncomfortable, both of them. Victims of circumstances beyond their complete control, both facing uncertain futures that depended on the decisions of strangers. The cattle auction proceeded with the brisk efficiency of men conducting serious business. Rebecca's steers were among the earlier lots, presented to a crowd of perhaps 30 potential buyers who evaluated them with professional detachment. The bidding started slowly but picked up momentum as 2 local ranchers recognized the animals' quality and began competing for ownership. When the hammer finally fell, Rebecca had received almost exactly the price Tom Bradley had estimated, enough to pay her immediate debts, purchase essential supplies for winter, and maintain a small reserve for emergencies. The relief she felt was physical, a loosening of tensions that had gripped her for months. But success brought new challenges, particularly the question of how she would manage the journey home while carrying a significant amount of cash through potentially dangerous territory. The contract labor auction began as Rebecca completed the paperwork for her cattle sale. She found herself lingering despite her need to purchase supplies and begin the return journey before afternoon weather made travel inadvisable. Something about Jake Sullivan's situation compelled her attention, though she couldn't articulate exactly what or why. The bidding for most of the men was perfunctory, with local businesses acquiring workers for specific projects at predetermined prices that barely covered their debts. But Jake Sullivan's case proved more complex. His military background and obvious education made him valuable for more than simple manual labor, but his physical limitations reduced his appeal for the heaviest work that typically required contracted men. Two potential buyers showed serious interest. Samuel Hartwell, who owned the largest ranch in the county, needed skilled horsemen who could train and manage his expanding herds. Despite Jake's limp, his expertise with horses was evident to anyone who observed his interaction with Thunder. But Hartwell's operation was located 40 miles north of Cedar Falls, in country where winter isolation could prove deadly for anyone whose physical limitations made them vulnerable. The second serious bidder was Marcus Webb, who operated a freight and supply business that required reliable men capable of handling complex logistics across challenging terrain. Webb's evaluation of Jake focused on his military experience and demonstrated ability to command respect from both animals and men. But Webb's business involved extensive travel under harsh conditions that might prove impossible for someone with Jake's mobility limitations. As the bidding progressed, Rebecca found herself calculating possibilities she had never considered before. Her homestead desperately needed skilled labor, particularly for projects that required expertise she didn't possess. Jake Sullivan's background suggested capabilities that exactly matched her most pressing needs: horse training, equipment repair, construction work, and the kind of practical problem-solving that military service developed. More importantly, his situation offered a solution to her most frightening prospect: facing childbirth alone in an isolated cabin during Montana's brutal winter. An experienced man capable of handling emergencies, managing livestock, and providing security could mean the difference between survival and catastrophe for both her and her unborn child. The financial arithmetic was daunting but manageable. Jake's debt totaled $87, a significant portion of her cattle proceeds, but not an impossible burden if his work could increase the homestead's productivity. Thunder's stable fees and veterinary bills added another $32, bringing the total investment to nearly half her available cash. But Rebecca recognized something else in Jake Sullivan's bearing that transcended mere practical considerations. His treatment of his injured horse revealed a character that valued loyalty and responsibility over convenience or profit. Despite his own desperate circumstances, he had refused to abandon Thunder, accepting the additional financial burden rather than betraying a companion who had served faithfully through shared dangers. When the bidding reached $75, with Marcus Webb holding the high offer, Rebecca surprised herself by raising her paddle for the first time. The gesture drew immediate attention from the crowd, most of whom had noticed the pregnant woman, but hadn't expected her to participate in human trafficking. Regardless of its legal technicalities, Webb's counterbid came immediately, pushing the price to $85 and within striking distance of Jake's total debt. Rebecca hesitated, acutely aware that she was contemplating a decision that would commit resources she could barely afford for outcomes she couldn't predict. But something in Jake Sullivan's expression as he watched his fate being decided convinced her that this was one of those moments when courage mattered more than calculation. Her final bid of $95 exceeded Jake's debt by enough to cover basic supplies and transportation to her homestead. The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever before the auctioneer called for additional bids that never came. Marcus Webb shook his head with the resignation of a man who understood when further competition was pointless. The hammer fell with the same sharp crack that had concluded the cattle sales. But this time the sound seemed to echo with possibilities Rebecca hadn't dared imagine when she woke that morning. She had purchased a man and his horse, taken responsibility for lives beyond her own, and committed herself to an arrangement that was either inspired wisdom or spectacular foolishness. Sullivan's expression as he realized his new circumstances mixed gratitude with wariness, understanding with uncertainty. He was no longer facing separation from Thunder or assignment to work that might prove impossible given his limitations, But he had also become the responsibility of a pregnant woman whose own situation appeared precarious at best. As the auction concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Rebecca approached her new employee with a mixture of determination and nervousness that probably matched his own feelings. The conversation that would follow would establish the terms of an arrangement unlike anything either of them had experienced before, a partnership born of mutual desperation but offering possibilities that neither could achieve alone. The morning that had begun with the simple goal of selling cattle had evolved into something far more complex and potentially transformative. Rebecca Hayes had acquired not just temporary labor, but companions whose presence would alter every aspect of her struggle for survival and success on the unforgiving Montana frontier. The conversation that would establish the terms of their unusual arrangement took place in the relative privacy of Tom Bradley's office, a cramped space above the stockyard that smelled of leather, tobacco, and the accumulated dust of countless business transactions. Rebecca sat carefully in the room's single chair while Jake Sullivan stood near the window, his injured leg clearly causing discomfort despite his efforts to conceal it. Thunder waited in the yard below, visible through the grimy glass, his intelligent head turning constantly as he monitored his surroundings with the alertness of a military mount. "Mrs. Hayes," Jake began, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone accustomed to military precision, "I want you to understand exactly what you've purchased before we proceed any further. I'm not a farm laborer or a simple ranch hand. My experience is primarily military, cavalry operations, reconnaissance, logistics coordination. I can work with horses, handle basic construction, and manage most practical problems that arise in frontier situations. But I've never worked a homestead, and my physical limitations may prevent me from handling the heaviest manual labor." His directness impressed Rebecca more than any attempt at false modesty might have. Frontier life demanded honest assessment of capabilities and limitations, particularly when lives might depend on accurate understanding of what each person could contribute. She studied his face as he spoke, noting the intelligence in his brown eyes and the unconscious authority that marked him as someone accustomed to command responsibilities. "Mr. Sullivan," she replied, matching his formal tone, "I didn't purchase your contract because I needed a farmhand. I need someone capable of making decisions, handling emergencies, and managing complex situations during what promises to be a difficult winter. Your military background suggests exactly the kind of competence I require, assuming you're willing to work for someone whose authority derives from ownership rather than rank." The question of authority was indeed central to their arrangements. Success. Jake had spent years in structured military hierarchies, where commands flowed downward through established chains of responsibility. Now he would answer to a pregnant woman whose only claim to leadership was her ownership of his labor contract and her knowledge of local conditions. The transition would require adjustments from both of them. "The terms are straightforward," Rebecca continued, referring to the contract documents Tom Bradley had prepared. "Your debt is satisfied, but you'll work for room board and a small monthly wage until next spring's planting is complete. That gives us approximately 6 months to determine whether this arrangement benefits both parties. If it proves successful, we can discuss permanent employment. If not, you'll be free to seek opportunities elsewhere." Jake nodded slowly, processing the implications of what she was proposing. 6 months would carry them through Montana's notorious winter and into the critical spring season when crop success or failure determined a homestead's viability for the coming year. It was a substantial commitment for both parties, requiring trust and cooperation that neither had reason to expect from their first encounter. "And thunder?" he asked, the question carrying obvious importance despite his attempt at casual delivery. "Thunder is welcome as long as his presence proves beneficial rather than burdensome," Rebecca replied. "A good horse is valuable on any frontier operation, assuming his injuries don't prevent useful work. Your judgment of his capabilities will be trusted unless circumstances prove otherwise. The relief that flickered across Jake's features confirmed what Rebecca had suspected about the depth of his attachment to the stallion. Military cavalry units developed bonds between riders and mounts that transcended simple utility, creating partnerships based on mutual dependence and shared danger. Separating Jake from Thunder would have been not just cruel, but counterproductive, eliminating much of what made him valuable as an employee. The practical details of their return journey required careful planning since Rebecca's original preparations had assumed solo travel. Jake's presence meant additional supplies were needed, but also provided security and assistance that would make the trip safer and more manageable. His evaluation of Thunder's condition was thorough and honest. The horse could travel but shouldn't be pushed hard, particularly over rough terrain that might aggravate his old injuries. "We'll need to purchase a pack animal," Jake observed after reviewing their supply requirements. "Thunder can carry me, but his load capacity is limited. Your mare looks capable, but you shouldn't be handling heavy packs in your condition. Good mule would solve most of our logistics problems and provide backup transportation if either horse develops problems." His assumption of planning responsibility felt natural rather than presumptuous, probably because his military experience had taught him to think systematically about complex operations. Rebecca found herself grateful for his methodical approach, particularly since her own planning had focused primarily on the outbound journey rather than the return trip with additional complications. The mule they eventually purchased was a sturdy, gray animal named Moses, whose previous owner recommended him as reliable in harsh weather and capable of carrying substantial loads across difficult terrain. Jake's evaluation was thorough, examining the animal's legs, teeth, and general condition with the expertise of someone who understood that equipment failures in frontier conditions could prove fatal. Their departure from Cedar Falls attracted less attention than Rebecca's arrival, partly because Jake's presence provided conventional explanations for what had previously seemed like unusual circumstances. A pregnant woman traveling with male protection fit established patterns of frontier movement, while her solo cattle drive had violated social expectations in ways that made people uncomfortable. The first miles of their return journey established patterns that would define their working relationship throughout the coming months. Jake naturally assumed responsibility for route planning and security assessments, drawing on military training that emphasized constant awareness of potential threats and contingency planning for various emergencies. Rebecca provided local knowledge and practical expertise about weather patterns, terrain challenges, and resource availability. Thunder's condition required frequent rest stops that actually benefited their entire party, since Rebecca's pregnancy made extended riding increasingly uncomfortable as the day progressed. The stallion's military training was evident in his steady temperament and immediate response to Jake's commands, but his injuries demanded careful attention to footing and pace that couldn't be ignored without risking permanent damage. Moses proved to be an excellent choice, maintaining steady progress while carrying supplies that would have been impossible for either rider to manage. The mule's calm disposition complemented Thunder's more spirited nature, creating a balanced team that handled the journey's challenges without the conflicts that sometimes developed between incompatible animals. The conversation that developed during their long hours of travel revealed surprising compatibility between two people whose backgrounds could hardly have been more different. Rebecca's education and frontier experience had given her perspectives on literature, politics, and social issues that matched Jake's military exposure to diverse people and places. Their discussions ranged from practical matters like crop rotation and animal husbandry to broader questions about territorial development and national politics. Jake's stories of military life provided Rebecca with insights into masculine frontier culture that had been largely foreign to her previous experience. His descriptions of cavalry operations revealed the complex logistics required to maintain mounted units across vast territories, knowledge that proved surprisingly relevant to homestead management. The skills required for coordinating supplies, managing animals, and leading men under difficult conditions translated directly to the challenges of frontier survival. Rebecca's accounts of her life with David and her subsequent months of solitary struggle gave Jake a new appreciation for the courage required by frontier women. His military experience had exposed him to physical danger and violent conflict, but the sustained psychological pressure of isolation and constant responsibility for survival represented challenges he had never fully understood. Her matter-of-fact descriptions of learning to perform traditionally masculine tasks while managing grief and pregnancy impressed him more than any battlefield heroics he had witnessed. The question of sleeping arrangements required delicate negotiation, since their traveling circumstances demanded shared camps while social conventions insisted on proper separation. They resolved the issue through practical compromises that acknowledged both necessity and propriety. Separate bedrolls positioned for mutual security but respectable distance. Shared fire and meal preparation, but individual privacy for personal needs. Jake's military training had taught him to establish efficient camps that maximized comfort while maintaining defensive readiness. His selection of sites emphasized water access, wind protection, and escape routes, while ensuring adequate forage for the animals. Rebecca contributed knowledge of local conditions and potential hazards that helped refine his choices for maximum safety and comfort. Thunder's evening routine revealed the depth of care Jake provided, despite their difficult circumstances. The stallion received thorough attention to his injured leg, careful checking of his hooves and equipment, and grooming that maintained both health and morale. Rebecca observed that Jake's treatment of his horse reflected character traits that would likely extend to his handling of all responsibilities. The baby's increased activity during their first evening together created an awkward moment that highlighted the intimacy their arrangement would require. Rebecca's sharp intake of breath as a particularly vigorous kick caught her off guard, drew Jake's immediate concern, his instinctive response revealing the protective instincts that military service had developed. His offer to assist was both appropriate and reassuring, suggesting that her medical needs during the coming months would receive competent attention. "I've assisted with field medical situations," he explained when Rebecca expressed surprise at his knowledge of pregnancy-related issues. Military units sometimes include camp followers, wives, laundresses, other women who accompany the troops. "I've helped with difficult births when proper medical care wasn't available. It's not ideal, but it's better than facing such situations alone." The admission provided Rebecca with a measure of comfort she hadn't expected to feel. The prospect of giving birth alone in an isolated cabin had haunted her dreams for months, but Jake's presence meant she would have assistance from someone with at least some relevant experience. His calm confidence suggested that emergencies wouldn't reduce him to panic or ineffective responses. Their second day of travel brought them through increasingly familiar territory as they approached the Hugh region where Rebecca's homestead was located. The landscape showed signs of the advancing season, leaves beginning to turn, morning frost that lasted longer each day, and the particular quality of light that warned of winter's approach. Both riders understood that their journey was more than simple transportation. It was a race against weather that could make travel impossible and force them into arrangements neither had fully considered. As they crested the final hill before Rebecca's valley came into view, both riders felt the weight of commitments they had made to each other and to uncertain futures that would test every assumption about cooperation, survival, and the possibilities for connection between strangers thrown together by desperate circumstances. The first sight of Rebecca's homestead through Jake's eyes revealed both its potential and its pressing needs with uncomfortable clarity. The cabin David had built stood solid and well-proportioned, But the surrounding buildings showed clear signs of deferred maintenance and incomplete projects that spoke of one person struggling to manage work designed for two. The half-finished barn dominated the immediate view, its frame complete, but lacking the siding and roofing that would make it functional before winter's arrival. Jake's military training had taught him to assess defensive positions and operational capabilities with systematic thoroughness, skills that translated directly to evaluating frontier properties. His initial survey identified strengths that could be maximized and vulnerabilities that required immediate attention. The homestead's location provided excellent water access and natural windbreaks, but the scattered outbuildings and incomplete fencing created security concerns that would become critical during harsh weather. "The foundation work is excellent," he observed as they approached the main cabin, his professional assessment carrying reassurance that Rebecca hadn't expected to need. "Your husband knew what he was doing when he selected this site and planned the layout. Most of the infrastructure is sound. It just needs completion and maintenance that one person couldn't manage alone." Thunder's behavior as they entered the homestead yard provided additional insight into Jake's character. The stallion remained alert, but showed none of the nervousness that might indicate poor treatment or harsh handling. His obvious trust in Jake's judgment suggested a partnership based on mutual respect rather than dominance, qualities that would likely extend to human relationships as well. The barn's completion became their first shared project, a test of how well their different expertise could combine to solve practical problems. Jake's approach emphasized structural integrity and efficient workflow, drawing on military engineering principles that maximized results while minimizing wasted effort. Rebecca contributed local knowledge about weather patterns and material availability that refined his plans for maximum effectiveness. Working together revealed unexpected compatibility in their problem-solving styles. Jake's systematic planning complemented Rebecca's intuitive understanding of frontier realities, creating solutions that neither could have achieved alone. Their discussions about construction details evolved naturally into broader conversations about the homestead's long-term development and the challenges they would face during the coming months. The physical demands of construction work tested Jake's limitations in ways that required honest acknowledgement of what he could and couldn't accomplish. His injured leg prevented him from working on the barn's highest sections, but his expertise with tools and understanding of structural principles made him invaluable for planning and supervising the complex assembly processes that Rebecca had been unable to attempt alone. Rebecca's pregnancy created complementary limitations that forced creative approaches to traditionally heavy labor. She couldn't lift large timbers or work in positions that stressed her changing body, but her smaller hands proved ideal for detail work, and her frontier experience had taught her techniques for moving heavy objects through leverage and patience. Rather than brute strength, Moses the mule proved to be an unexpected asset for construction work, his steady temperament and considerable strength making him ideal for hauling materials and providing power for tasks that would have been impossible for humans alone. Jake's ability to work effectively with draft animals expanded their capabilities significantly, enabling projects that had seemed impossible when Rebecca faced them alone. The rhythm of shared labor created opportunities for conversation that revealed depths of character neither had expected from their initial encounter. Jake's military stories illustrated a worldview shaped by service to something larger than personal interest, while Rebecca's accounts of frontier survival demonstrated the kind of practical courage that military heroism sometimes lacked. Their growing mutual respect was based on demonstrated competence rather than social conventions or romantic attraction. Evening routines evolved naturally as they established patterns that balanced efficiency with propriety. Jake took responsibility for animal care and security preparations, while Rebecca managed meal preparation and domestic organization. Their shared meals became opportunities for planning the next day's work and discussing the broader challenges they would face as winter approached. The question of sleeping arrangements required ongoing negotiation as October's temperatures made outdoor camping increasingly uncomfortable. The cabin's single room provided adequate space for separate sleeping areas, but the intimacy of shared quarters demanded careful attention to boundaries and mutual comfort. Their solution involved hanging blankets to create privacy while maintaining the shared warmth that would become essential during winter's coldest periods. Jake's medical knowledge proved valuable almost immediately when Rebecca experienced complications that sent sharp pains through her lower back and created concerns about the baby's welfare. His calm assessment and practical recommendations, rest, warmth, and careful monitoring of symptoms, provided both physical relief and psychological comfort that helped her manage anxiety about giving birth without proper medical attention. Military surgeons deal with more than battlefield wounds, he explained when Rebecca expressed gratitude for his competent care. Camp life includes all the medical situations that arise when people live in isolated conditions. I've assisted with everything from broken bones to complicated births. I'm not a doctor, but I understand more about frontier medicine than most civilians. The livestock presented both immediate challenges and long-term opportunities as Jake assessed their needs and potential for expansion. Rebecca's small herd was healthy but showed signs of inconsistent management that reflected her limited experience with animal husbandry. Jake's cavalry background had taught him to read animal behavior and identify health problems before they became serious, skills that could significantly improve their livestock's productivity. Thunder's integration into the existing herd dynamics required careful management since his military training and stallion temperament could disrupt established patterns among Rebecca's more docile farm animals. Jake's handling of the situation demonstrated sophisticated understanding of animal psychology, introducing Thunder gradually while establishing clear hierarchies that maintained peace among animals with very different backgrounds and temperaments. The homestead's defensive preparations became increasingly important as reports filtered in about increased Blackfoot raiding parties moving through the territory ahead of winter. Jake's military experience made him acutely aware of the homestead's vulnerabilities and the precautions necessary to protect isolated settlers during periods of increased hostility. His recommendations for improving security were practical rather than alarmist, focusing on deterrence and early warning rather than fortress-like defenses. Rebecca's shooting skills required assessment and improvement since her husband's death had left her as the homestead's primary defender until Jake's arrival. Her basic competence with David's rifle needed refinement for accuracy and speed, particularly since Jake's injured leg might limit his mobility during emergency situations. Their practice sessions revealed that Rebecca possessed steady nerves and good hand-eye coordination that could be developed into genuine marksmanship with proper instruction. The approach of winter demanded accelerated completion of essential preparations that would determine their survival during the harsh months ahead. Firewood cutting became a shared priority that tested their ability to coordinate efforts efficiently while managing their physical limitations. Jake's expertise with axes and saws complemented Rebecca's knowledge of local wood types and burning characteristics, enabling them to accumulate adequate fuel supplies before weather made outdoor work impossible. Food preservation represented another area where their combined knowledge produced better results than either could achieve alone. Rebecca's frontier experience with smoking, drying, and root cellar storage was enhanced by Jake's military understanding of ration planning and nutrition requirements for sustained physical labor under harsh conditions. Their collaborative approach to winter provisioning reflected growing confidence in their partnership's effectiveness. The social dynamics of their unusual arrangement began to attract attention from neighboring families who had observed Jake's arrival and were curious about Rebecca's decision to employ a stranger under such intimate circumstances. The Patterson family's visit provided their first test of how well they could present their arrangement to satisfy community expectations while maintaining the privacy necessary for their working relationship. John Patterson's evaluation of Jake was thorough and practical, focusing on his competence and character rather than the unusual circumstances of his employment. Mary Patterson's concerns were more delicate, addressing the propriety questions that naturally arose when an unmarried man lived in close quarters with a pregnant widow. Their eventual acceptance of the arrangement reflected frontier pragmatism that valued survival over conventional social expectations. Jake's presence at Sunday church services in Cedar Falls created additional opportunities for community integration, while demonstrating his respect for local customs and Rebecca's reputation. His military bearing and obvious competence impressed the male congregation, while his deferential treatment of Rebecca satisfied those who had worried about her vulnerability to exploitation by an unscrupulous employee. The developing trust between Rebecca and Jake was tested when complications with her pregnancy created a medical emergency that required immediate decisions about treatment and risk management. Jake's calm response to her crisis demonstrated the kind of steady competence that military service had developed, but also revealed the depth of personal concern that had grown beyond mere professional obligation. As November approached and winter's advance became undeniable, both Rebecca and Jake recognized that their experimental partnership had evolved into something more substantial and permanent than either had originally envisioned. The homestead was better prepared for harsh weather than it had been in years, their combined efforts having accomplished work that would have been impossible for either person alone. But more importantly, they had discovered that their very different backgrounds and experiences created complementary strengths that addressed each other's limitations in ways that suggested possibilities for long-term partnership extending far beyond the original contract terms. The question of what would happen when spring arrived and Jake's obligation was fulfilled remained unspoken, but increasingly important as their emotional investment in each other's welfare grew deeper with each passing day. The first serious blizzard of the season struck in mid-November with the sudden ferocity that made Montana winters legendary among frontier settlers. Rebecca woke to the sound of wind howling around the cabin's corners and the peculiar muffled silence that indicated heavy snowfall. Through the frost-covered window, she could see nothing but swirling white that had transformed the familiar landscape into an alien world, where landmarks disappeared and direction became impossible to determine. Jake was already awake, moving quietly through his morning routine, while monitoring the storm's intensity with the practiced attention of someone who understood that weather could quickly become a life-or-death concern. His military experience in harsh conditions had taught him to read atmospheric signs that civilians often missed, and his expression carried the gravity of someone who recognized this as more than a simple snowfall. "This one's going to last at least 2 days," he said quietly, not wanting to alarm Rebecca, but ensuring she understood their situation. "Maybe 3, judging by the wind patterns and pressure changes. We'll need to check the animals frequently and make sure our supply lines to the barn and outbuildings remain clear. The snow could pile up high enough to block doors and trap us inside." The storm tested every aspect of their winter preparations with ruthless efficiency. The firewood they had split and stacked required constant replenishment as the cabin's heating demands increased dramatically. Jake's systematic approach to fuel management became essential as he calculated burn rates and rationed their supplies to ensure adequate warmth throughout the storm's duration without depleting reserves needed for the entire winter. Animal care during the blizzard required heroic efforts that pushed both Rebecca and Jake to their physical limits. The path to the barn became a lifeline that needed constant maintenance as drifting snow threatened to make it impassable. Jake rigged a rope guide between the cabin and barn, creating a safety line that would prevent them from becoming lost in the whiteout conditions that could prove fatal within yards of shelter. Thunder's presence in the barn provided unexpected benefits during the crisis. His military training had accustomed him to harsh conditions and emergency situations, making him a calming influence on Rebecca's more skittish farm animals. The stallion's steady behavior helped prevent the kind of panic that could injure livestock or damage equipment during the storm's worst moments. Rebecca's pregnancy created additional complications as the physical demands of storm survival tested her endurance in ways that peaceful autumn work had not. The constant trips through deep snow left her exhausted and struggling with balance problems that made every journey to the barn a potential disaster. Jake's protective vigilance became essential as he took responsibility for the most dangerous tasks while ensuring Rebecca contributed within her capabilities without risking injury. The cabin's interior took on the atmosphere of a military command post as Jake organized their resources and established routines that maximized efficiency while conserving energy and supplies. His ability to remain calm under pressure provided psychological stability that helped Rebecca manage the anxiety created by their complete isolation and dependence on their own resources for survival. The second day of the storm brought a medical emergency that tested Jake's frontier healthcare abilities under conditions that would have challenged trained physicians. Rebecca experienced severe cramping and bleeding that suggested potential complications with her pregnancy, symptoms that could indicate anything from normal stress responses to serious problems requiring immediate intervention. Jake's response demonstrated the kind of steady competence that military service had developed through exposure to medical crises under impossible conditions. His examination was thorough but gentle, his questions designed to gather essential information without increasing Rebecca's anxiety. His assessment suggested bed rest and careful monitoring rather than panic, but his vigilance made clear that he understood the seriousness of their situation. "We'll watch for fever, increased bleeding, or changes in the baby's movement," he explained, his calm voice providing reassurance despite the gravity of their circumstances. Most pregnancy complications resolve with rest and proper care, but we need to be prepared for different possibilities. I've assisted with difficult births before, and while I'm not a doctor, I understand enough to help if emergency delivery becomes necessary. The storm's isolation forced intimate conversations about subjects they had previously avoided discussing. Rebecca's fears about childbirth in frontier conditions became topics for practical planning rather than private anxiety. Jake's military experiences with field medicine provided frameworks for understanding potential complications and developing response strategies that gave Rebecca confidence in their ability to handle whatever challenges might arise. Their shared vigil during Rebecca's medical crisis revealed the depth of emotional connection that had developed beyond mere business partnership. Jake's obvious concern for her welfare went far beyond professional obligation, while Rebecca's trust in his judgment reflected feelings that had grown much deeper than gratitude for competent assistance. The life-threatening situation forced acknowledgement of attachments that had been developing quietly. Through weeks of shared work and growing mutual respect, the third day brought a gradual reduction in wind intensity that suggested the storm's peak had passed, though snow continued falling at rates that made outdoor travel dangerous. Jake's reconnaissance missions to check their perimeter and assess damage revealed that their preparations had been adequate but barely so. Several outbuildings had sustained damage from wind and snow loading, while drifts against the barn reached heights that would require significant labor to clear. The psychological impact of complete isolation became more apparent as the storm's intensity decreased, and they began to consider their situation from broader perspectives. They had been cut off from all human contact for 3 days, dependent entirely on each other for survival, companionship, and medical care. The experience had forged bonds that went beyond anything their original arrangement had contemplated. Rebecca's recovery from her pregnancy scare proceeded smoothly under Jake's attentive care, but the incident had highlighted their vulnerability and the potential consequences of medical emergencies and isolated conditions. Their discussions about contingency planning became more detailed and specific, addressing scenarios that ranged from premature labor to serious injuries that could leave one of them unable to care for the other. The storm's aftermath revealed both damage and opportunities as they assessed their situation and planned recovery efforts. Several sections of fencing had been destroyed by wind and falling tree branches, but the downed timber could be salvaged for firewood or construction materials. The barn had weathered the storm well, validating Jake's structural improvements and demonstrating the value of proper preparation. Their first post-storm venture to check on neighbors required careful navigation through transformed terrain, where familiar landmarks had been altered by massive snowdrifts and fallen trees. The journey to the Patterson homestead became an expedition that tested their route-finding abilities and revealed the storm's impact on the broader community. The Pattersons had fared reasonably well, though John Patterson's livestock had suffered losses that would impact his family's winter food supplies. The neighborly assistance that followed, sharing preserved meat, helping with repairs, and coordinating resource allocation, demonstrated the mutual aid networks that enabled frontier communities to survive disasters that would overwhelm individual families. Jake's integration into these community support systems proceeded naturally as his competence and reliability became apparent to other settlers. His military background provided valuable expertise for organizing group efforts and coordinating complex projects that required multiple families to work together effectively. The respect he earned through demonstrated capability helped establish his permanent place in the local social structure. The relationship between Rebecca and Jake underwent subtle but significant changes as the shared trauma of the storm created emotional intimacy that neither had anticipated. Their conversations became more personal, touching on hopes and fears that went beyond immediate survival concerns. The artificial boundaries maintained by their employer-employee arrangement began to feel increasingly artificial and constraining. December's arrival brought renewed challenges as sustained cold temperatures created different problems from the dramatic but temporary crisis of the November blizzard. The daily grind of winter survival, maintaining fires, caring for animals, preserving food supplies, and managing the psychological stress of isolation tested their partnership in ways that required different strengths from those needed during emergency situations. Jake's presence during this period proved invaluable not just for practical assistance, but for the psychological support that prevented the kind of despair that could destroy isolated settlers during the darkest months. His steady optimism and military discipline provided structure and purpose that helped Rebecca maintain hope and energy when cabin fever and pregnancy fatigue threatened to overwhelm her. Determination. Their Christmas celebration reflected the peculiar mixture of hardship and contentment that marked their unusual partnership. Limited resources meant simple gifts and modest festivities, but their shared appreciation for survival and companionship created warmth that expensive presents couldn't have matched. The holiday marked a transition point where both began to acknowledge that their relationship had evolved far beyond the terms of any employment contract. The new year would bring different challenges as Rebecca's pregnancy advanced toward its conclusion, and questions about their long-term future became impossible to postpone indefinitely. But the winter's trials had proven that their partnership could withstand serious stress while providing both practical benefits and emotional fulfillment that neither had expected to find in their desperate circumstances. As January's brutal cold settled over the Montana territory, Rebecca and Jake faced the final test of winter's endurance trial with confidence, born of shared hardship and growing certainty that whatever the future held, they would face it together as partners whose bond had been forged in necessity but strengthened by choice. February arrived with the kind of bitter cold that made breathing painful and turned simple tasks into battles against nature's determination to test human endurance beyond reasonable limits. The thermometer Jake had mounted outside the cabin window registered temperatures that hadn't been seen in the territory for over a decade, creating conditions where exposed skin could freeze in minutes and metal became so cold it could burn. Like fire, Rebecca's pregnancy had reached the stage where every movement required careful consideration and planning. At 8.5 months, her body had taken on the ponderous dignity of approaching motherhood, but her swollen ankles and constant back pain made even routine tasks increasingly difficult. Jake had gradually assumed responsibility for most physical labor while ensuring Rebecca remained active enough to maintain her strength for the ordeal ahead. The baby's movements had become a constant presence that dominated Rebecca's awareness, particularly during the quiet evening hours when she and Jake sat by the fire discussing practical preparations for the birth. They had transformed one corner of the cabin into a makeshift medical station, equipped with clean linens, sterilized instruments, and the various supplies Jake's military experience suggested might prove necessary during a difficult delivery. The timing concerns me, Jake admitted during one of their planning sessions, his honesty reflecting the trust that had developed between them over the winter months. February births in frontier conditions carry additional risks because of the weather. Isolation. If complications develop that require medical expertise beyond what I can provide, we'll have no options for outside assistance until spring thaw makes travel possible. Rebecca appreciated his directness more than false reassurances would have comforted her. Frontier life demanded honest assessment of risks and realistic preparation for all possible outcomes. Her own research into childbirth procedures had given her enough knowledge to understand both the normal process and the various complications that could transform a natural event into a life-threatening emergency. The psychological preparation proved as important as the physical arrangements. Rebecca had spent hours mentally rehearsing the birth process, visualizing successful outcomes, while acknowledging the possibility of problems that might require difficult decisions. Jake's steady presence provided confidence that whatever happened, she wouldn't face it alone or without competent assistance from someone whose experience under pressure could make the difference between success and tragedy. Their relationship had evolved throughout the winter into something that transcended their original business arrangement without being formally acknowledged or defined. The intimacy created by shared hardship and mutual dependence had grown into genuine affection and respect that both recognized but neither had openly discussed. The approaching birth would force conversations about their future that could no longer be postponed indefinitely. The first signs of labor began during a howling blizzard that made their isolation complete and final. Rebecca woke to cramping that felt different from the false alarms she had experienced during previous weeks, accompanied by a sense of internal pressure and urgency that her body recognized even if her mind remained uncertain about timing and progression. Jake's response to her quiet announcement that labor might be beginning demonstrated the calm preparedness that months of planning had developed. His systematic approach to activating their birth plan reflected military training that emphasized thorough preparation, followed by flexible adaptation to changing circumstances. Within minutes, he had assembled their medical supplies and begun the careful monitoring that would guide his assistants throughout the process. "The contractions are still irregular," he observed after timing several episodes with the pocket watch that had belonged to his cavalry unit. "Probably early labor, which gives us time to ensure everything is properly arranged. Try to rest between contractions and conserve your energy for when the real work begins. I'll monitor your progress and make adjustments as needed." The early stages of labor proceeded slowly through the night, giving Rebecca time to adjust to the increasing intensity of contractions, while Jake maintained vigilant attention to her condition and the various factors that could indicate developing problems. His military experience with field medicine had taught him to watch for specific warning signs that might require immediate intervention or changes in treatment approach. The Storm outside provided an ironic backdrop to the drama unfolding within the cabin. Nature's fury raged against their small shelter, while another natural force worked toward creation rather than destruction. The contrast wasn't lost on either Rebecca or Jake as they focused on bringing new life into a world that seemed determined to test every aspect of human endurance and determination. As dawn approached, Rebecca's labor intensified significantly, transforming the manageable discomfort of early contractions into waves of pain that demanded all her concentration and willpower. Jake's coaching became essential as he guided her through breathing techniques and position changes that military field manuals had identified as effective for managing difficult births under primitive conditions. "You're doing exactly what you need to do," he reassured her during a particularly intense contraction, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had witnessed births under far worse conditions than their well-prepared cabin. "The baby is positioned correctly, your strength is holding steady, and everything is progressing normally. Trust your body and trust the process." The hours that followed tested every aspect of their partnership as Rebecca's labor progressed through stages that required different types of support and assistance. Jake's medical knowledge proved invaluable for recognizing normal progression versus complications that might require intervention, while his steady presence provided psychological support that helped Rebecca maintain focus and determination. When exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her willpower, the final stage of labor brought challenges that pushed both of them to their limits. Rebecca's exhaustion after 12 hours of increasing intensity made each contraction a monumental effort that required Jake's constant encouragement and practical assistance. His experience with emergency births became crucial as he guided the baby's delivery with competent hands that remained steady. Despite the emotional intensity of the moment, the baby's first cry echoed through the cabin, like a victory shout that announced the successful completion of their most important shared endeavor. Rebecca's tears of relief and exhaustion mixed with Jake's obvious emotion as they both contemplated the tiny life they had brought safely into the world through skill, preparation, and the kind of teamwork that had carried them through every challenge they had faced together. "A daughter," Jake announced with the wonder that marked his first experience delivering a baby he had personal investment in protecting. "Healthy lungs, good color, all the fingers and toes properly arranged. She's perfect, Rebecca. Absolutely perfect." The immediate aftermath of birth required continued vigilance as Jake monitored both mother and baby for signs of complications that could develop even after successful delivery. His military training had emphasized that the first hours after birth were critical for ensuring long-term survival and health, particularly under frontier conditions where medical assistance remained unavailable. Rebecca's recovery proceeded smoothly under Jake's attentive care, though the exhaustion of labor left her weak and dependent on his assistance for basic needs. The role reversal felt natural rather than awkward, probably because their partnership had been based on mutual support, rather than rigid definitions of who should provide what types of care under different circumstances. The baby's needs created new rhythms and responsibilities that both parents embraced with the dedication of people who understood how precious and fragile their success had been. Feeding, changing, and monitoring the infant required constant attention that Jake shared willingly despite having no previous experience with newborn care. His systematic approach to learning baby care reflected the same methodical competence he had brought to every other challenge. The naming decision opened conversations about their relationship and future that could no longer be avoided or postponed. Rebecca's suggestion that the baby should carry both their names acknowledged the reality that Jake had become more than an employee or temporary partner. His obvious emotional investment in both mother and child had created family bonds that transcended legal contracts or social conventions. "Sarah Elizabeth Sullivan Hayes," Rebecca proposed during one of their quiet evening discussions while the baby slept peacefully between them. "If you're willing to claim her as your daughter and me as your wife, assuming such arrangements are acceptable to a former cavalry officer with better options than a frontier widow and her baby. Jake's response carried the emotional weight of months of growing attachment and commitment that had developed through shared hardship and mutual dependence. Rebecca, I've been hoping you would reach that conclusion, because I've been afraid to presume that my feelings were reciprocated. This partnership has become the most important thing in my life, and I can't imagine a future that doesn't include you and Sarah as my family. The marriage proposal that followed was as practical and honest as everything else about their relationship had been. They needed each other for survival and success, but more importantly, they had discovered compatibility and affection that promised happiness as well as security. Their wedding would wait until spring travel became possible and proper ceremonies could be arranged, but their commitment was already complete. The baby's presence transformed their cabin from a temporary shelter into a permanent home where three people would build a life together. The responsibilities of parenthood added new dimensions to their partnership while strengthening bonds that had been tested by every challenge. Frontier life could devise. As February's bitter cold began to show signs of yielding to March's gradual warming, Rebecca and Jake contemplated their future with confidence born of proven ability to handle whatever challenges might arise. They had survived winter, brought new life safely into the world, and discovered that love could grow from the most unlikely circumstances when people were willing to trust each other completely. The homestead that had once seemed like a trap, threatening to destroy a desperate widow, had become the foundation for a family whose bonds were stronger than blood because they had been chosen deliberately and tested thoroughly. Sarah Elizabeth would grow up knowing that love could triumph over any obstacle when backed by courage, competence, and commitment to each other's welfare above personal comfort or convenience. Spring's arrival in the Montana Territory came with the gradual insistence of a season that refused to be hurried, despite the desperate longing of people who had endured winter's relentless testing. The first patches of bare ground appeared in early March, dark scars against the snow that promised eventual freedom from the isolation that had defined their existence for months. Rebecca stood at the cabin window, baby Sarah cradled in her arms, watching Jake repair storm damage to the barn's roof with the methodical precision that marked all his work. The transformation of their relationship from desperate partnership to chosen family had brought unexpected challenges along with its obvious benefits. Caring for a newborn while maintaining the demanding routines of frontier survival required adjustments that tested their ability to balance competing priorities. Sarah's needs couldn't be postponed for weather or agricultural demands, but spring planting wouldn't wait for convenient moments between feeding and diaper changes. Jake's adaptation to fatherhood revealed aspects of his character that military service had never required. His patient attention to Sarah's every sound and movement demonstrated protective instincts that went far beyond duty or obligation. He had fashioned a wooden cradle with intricate carved details that spoke of hours spent creating something beautiful. For his daughter, working by lamplight after completing the day's essential tasks. "She has your eyes," he observed during one of their evening conversations, his voice carrying the wonder that still marked his adjustment to parenthood. "And your stubborn determination, judging by the way she insists on being fed exactly when she wants rather than when it's convenient. She's going to be formidable when she gets older." The comment reflected changes in how Jake viewed his role within their family structure. He had naturally assumed the responsibilities of fatherhood without formal adoption procedures or legal documentation, accepting Sarah as his daughter through choice rather than biological connection. His commitment to both mother and child had deepened through the daily intimacies of shared care and mutual dependence. Rebecca's recovery from childbirth proceeded smoothly under Jake's attentive care, though the physical demands of nursing while maintaining her share of frontier responsibilities required careful management of her energy and health. The partnership that had sustained them through winter evolved to accommodate the reality that three people now depended on their ability to work together effectively. The approaching spring also brought anticipation of their formal wedding, an event that required coordination with community schedules and weather conditions that would allow travel to Cedar Falls, where a proper ceremony could be conducted. Their engagement had been announced through letters carried by the first travelers able to navigate the winter-damaged trails, creating expectations for a celebration that would mark both personal commitment and community integration. Planning. Their wedding revealed the extent to which Jake had been accepted into local society during his months on the homestead. John Patterson had offered to serve as best man, while Mary Patterson and Adelaide Morton were coordinating arrangements for a reception that would accommodate the social expectations of frontier communities, where marriages were celebratory events for entire neighborhoods rather than private family affairs. The legal complexities of their situation required careful attention, since Jake's original status as indentured labor created potential complications for property ownership and parental rights. Rebecca's consultation with the territorial attorney in Cedar Falls resulted in paperwork that formally terminated Jake's contract and established his legal standing as an independent citizen capable of entering marriage and claiming parental responsibilities. Sarah's presence in their daily routines created new rhythms that had to accommodate both infant needs and agricultural demands. The approaching planting season couldn't be delayed for childcare convenience, but Rebecca's nursing schedule meant she couldn't work the extended hours that spring farming typically required. Their solution involved Jake taking primary responsibility for field preparation, while Rebecca managed livestock and domestic tasks that could be interrupted as necessary for baby care. The coordination required for these arrangements demonstrated how thoroughly their partnership had evolved beyond simple division of labor to become genuine cooperation, based on mutual understanding of each other's capabilities and limitations. Jake's willingness to assume traditionally feminine responsibilities when circumstances required it reflected both practical necessity and genuine respect for Rebecca's contributions to their shared enterprise. Thunder's role in their expanding family operations became increasingly important as spring work demanded the kind of heavy labor that required reliable draft animals. The stallion's military training translated well to agricultural applications, though his spirited temperament required careful handling to prevent accidents that could prove catastrophic during critical planting periods. Jake's expertise with horses ensured that Thunder's capabilities were utilized safely while his limitations were respected. The baby's effect on their livestock was unexpectedly positive, as the domestic animals seemed to respond favorably to the sounds and activities associated with infant care. Rebecca observed that the milk cows produced more consistently when Sarah's cries indicated feeding times, while the chickens appeared more settled and productive when their routines included the regular household activities that revolved around baby care. Community integration accelerated as neighboring families made excuses to visit and meet the new baby, while evaluating how Jake's presence had affected the homestead's prospects and Rebecca's situation. These social calls served multiple purposes, providing human contact that helped prevent the isolation that could prove psychologically devastating for frontier families, while establishing Jake's reputation within the network of mutual assistance that enabled scattered homesteads to survive agricultural and weather emergencies. The Pattersons' assessment of Jake's character and competence proved particularly important, since John Patterson's opinion carried significant weight within the local farming community. His endorsement of Jake as a reliable neighbor and capable partner for Rebecca helped establish social acceptance that might otherwise have developed slowly through gradual demonstration of worthiness. The economic prospects for their expanding family required careful evaluation as they planned agricultural activities that would need to support 3 people rather than 2. The additional mouth to feed was balanced by Jake's full contribution to productive labor. But the long-term financial planning needed to account for Sarah's future needs, including education expenses and eventual marriage costs that responsible parents were expected to provide. Jake's military pension provided modest but reliable income that supplemented their agricultural earnings, while reducing their dependence on crop success for basic survival. This financial security enabled them to consider improvements and expansions that would have been too risky for Rebecca to attempt alone, including livestock investments and equipment purchases that could significantly increase their productive capacity. The spring weather patterns proved favorable for early planting, with soil conditions and moisture levels that promised good germination if they could complete seeding before late. Cold snaps damaged emerging crops. Jake's systematic approach to field preparation reflected military planning principles that maximized efficiency while ensuring thorough completion of essential tasks. Rebecca's involvement in spring planting required creative arrangements that accommodated Sarah's feeding schedule while ensuring adequate help with time-sensitive agricultural work. Their solution involved portable cradle arrangements that allowed Rebecca to work in the fields while keeping the baby nearby for nursing and general supervision, a compromise that satisfied both parental responsibilities and farming demands. Physical demands of spring farming tested Rebecca's post-pregnancy recovery in ways that required careful attention to her health and stamina. Jake's protective oversight ensured that she didn't overextend herself while still contributing meaningfully to their shared workload. His ability to recognize when she needed rest or assistance reflected the intimate knowledge of each other's capabilities that their partnership had developed at the approaching wedding date, created additional pressures as they balanced ceremony preparations with agricultural responsibilities that couldn't be postponed for social conveniences. The timing required coordination between optimal planting conditions and community availability for celebration, factors that weren't always compatible with each other or with Sarah's unpredictable schedule. Jake's bachelor party, organized by John Patterson and the other local men, provided opportunities for community bonding that helped establish his permanent place within the social networks that define frontier neighborhoods. The evening's activities included traditional celebrations, along with practical discussions about farming techniques, weather predictions, and the various challenges that would face all local families during the coming growing season. Rebecca's preparations for marriage involved more than simple ceremony planning, since her status as Jake's wife would formalize arrangements that had developed through necessity rather than courtship. The transition from employer-employee relationship to husband-wife partnership required adjustments in how they related to each other and how the community perceived their family structure. The week before their wedding brought unexpected visitors in the form of Circuit Court Judge Harrison Blackwood and his traveling entourage, officials whose presence in Cedar Falls provided opportunities for legal formalities that would ensure their marriage was properly documented and legally recognized throughout the territory. Judge Blackwood's examination of their situation reflected the complex legal issues created when unconventional relationships needed to be fitted into established frameworks of marriage and property law. His eventual approval of their arrangements provided official validation that removed potential future complications while establishing clear legal standing for their family unit. As their wedding day approached, Rebecca and Jake contemplated the remarkable journey that had brought them from desperate strangers at an auction to committed partners, preparing to formalize bonds that had been tested by every challenge frontier life could devise. Their relationship had proven that love could grow from the most unlikely circumstances, when people were willing to trust each other completely and work together toward shared goals that transcended individual interests. The weeks following their wedding brought challenges that Rebecca and Jake had never anticipated during their careful planning for married life. Success, they discovered, created its own complications as their homestead's productivity attracted attention from sources that ranged from beneficial to potentially dangerous. Word of their agricultural achievements had spread throughout the territory, bringing visitors whose motivations weren't always as innocent as they initially appeared. The first indication of unwelcome interest came when 3 strangers arrived at their homestead, claiming to represent investment opportunities for expanding frontier operations. Marcus Thornfield, who introduced himself as a representative of the Montana Territorial Development Company, possessed the smooth manner and expensive clothing that marked him as someone accustomed to influencing people through charm rather than honest dealing. "Mr. and Mrs. Sullivan," Thornfield began, his practiced smile not quite reaching eyes that constantly evaluated their property and possessions. "Your operation here has attracted considerable attention among investors looking for successful enterprises to support and expand. We're prepared to offer partnership arrangements that could multiply your current income while providing security against the uncertainties that face all frontier agricultural ventures." Jake's military experience had taught him to recognize situations where apparent opportunities concealed significant dangers. His polite but non-committal responses to Thornfield's increasingly elaborate proposals reflected instinctive wariness of deals that seemed too generous to be genuine. Rebecca shared his suspicions, particularly when the visitors showed more interest in their property boundaries and water rights than in their actual farming methods or crop yields. The revelation of Thornfield's true intentions came through information provided by Tom Bradley. During their next trip to Cedar Falls, the Montana Territorial Development Company was a front organization for land speculators who identified successful homesteads and then used various legal and illegal methods to force sales at below-market prices. Their typical approach involved creating artificial problems, disputed claims, harassment by hired troublemakers, or manufactured emergencies that made continued ownership seem impossible or dangerous. "They've targeted at least 6 families in this county," Bradley warned during a private conversation in his stockyard office. "The Hendersons lost their place after mysterious fires destroyed their barn and spooked their cattle. The Morrison family gave up after their well was poisoned, and their crops were systematically destroyed by what appeared to be natural pests, but was probably deliberate sabotage." The information transformed Rebecca and Jake's understanding of their situation from simple success to potential vulnerability. Their homestead's value as a proven agricultural operation made it attractive to speculators who preferred stealing established enterprises to developing raw land through honest labor. The protection they needed went beyond normal frontier self-defense to include vigilance against sophisticated threats that could destroy everything they had built. Jake's response to this intelligence reflected military strategic thinking applied to civilian defense. He began organizing neighborhood watch arrangements with other targeted families, establishing communication networks that could provide early warning of suspicious activities, and coordinating mutual assistance agreements that would enable rapid response to threats against any member of their informal alliance. The baby's presence complicated their defensive planning since Sarah's safety became the primary consideration that influenced every decision about how to respond to potential threats. Normal frontier violence between adults was manageable through established protocols, but protecting an infant from determined adversaries required different approaches that emphasized prevention and escape rather than direct confrontation. Rebecca's maternal instincts had sharpened into protective awareness that monitored every aspect of their environment for potential dangers to Sarah. Her ability to continue normal activities while maintaining constant vigilance demonstrated the particular strength that frontier motherhood developed in women, whose children's survival depended on their capability to recognize and respond to threats that could emerge without warning. The agricultural demands of late spring and early summer created additional vulnerabilities as their attention was necessarily focused on crop management during critical growing periods. Sabotage attempts would be most effective during planting and cultivation seasons when damage to fields could destroy entire years of investment and planning. Jake's military background enabled him to devise security measures that protected their crops without requiring constant personal supervision. Their relationship with thunder proved unexpectedly valuable for security purposes, as the stallions' military training had included alert and guard duties that transferred directly to homestead protection. The horse's ability to detect approaching strangers and signal warnings through behavioral changes provided early warning capabilities that human sentries couldn't match, particularly during nighttime hours when visibility was limited. The community support network that had developed around their marriage proved essential for coordinating defense against threats that were too sophisticated for individual families to handle alone. John Patterson's experience with territorial politics provided insights into legal protections available through proper documentation and official channels, while other neighbors contributed practical knowledge about dealing with various forms of harassment and intimidation. The first direct attack came in the form of contaminated water supplies that threatened both human and animal health on multiple homesteads simultaneously. The systematic nature of the poisoning indicated coordination and resources beyond what local troublemakers could organize, confirming suspicions that they were facing professional adversaries with significant financial backing and sophisticated operational capabilities. Jake's investigation of the water contamination revealed evidence of deliberate sabotage that had been designed to appear like natural contamination from upstream mining activities. The technical complexity of the operation indicated involvement by people with engineering knowledge and access to industrial chemicals, capabilities that suggested corporate rather than criminal motivations. The territorial authorities' response to reports of systematic harassment was disappointingly inadequate, reflecting either incompetence or corruption that made official protection unreliable. Sheriff William Hartman's cursory investigation and dismissive attitude toward evidence of organized criminal activity suggested that legal remedies would not be available for defending against continued attacks. Rebecca's analysis of their legal options revealed the extent to which territorial law favored established businesses and outside investors over individual homesteaders. The property rights that seemed to protect their ownership could be undermined through technical challenges and procedural manipulation by adversaries, with better legal representation and political connections than frontier families could afford. The psychological pressure of living under constant threat began affecting their daily routines and long-term planning in ways that threatened to achieve the enemy's goals without requiring continued direct attacks. The uncertainty about when and how the next assault might come created stress that made normal activities difficult and interfered with the agricultural focus that their survival required. Sarah's development during this period reflected both the love that surrounded her and the tension that marked her parents' struggle to maintain normal family life while defending against sophisticated threats. Her cheerful responsiveness to attention and affection provided emotional anchor points that reminded Rebecca and Jake of what they were fighting to protect and why their resistance mattered beyond personal pride or property rights. The solution to their security crisis came through an unexpected alliance with other targeted families who had reached similar conclusions about the inadequacy of individual responses to organized threats. The formation of the Cedar Valley Protective Association created cooperative capabilities that enabled effective resistance against enemies who had successfully intimidated isolated homesteaders. Jake's election as the association's tactical coordinator reflected both his military expertise and the respect he had earned within the community through demonstrated competence and reliability. His organizational abilities proved essential for coordinating complex defensive measures across multiple properties while maintaining the agricultural activities that provided economic foundation for their resistance efforts. The association's First major success came when coordinated surveillance efforts identified the headquarters and operational methods used by Thornfield's organization. The intelligence gathering that followed revealed criminal activities that provided evidence for federal intervention under territorial development, regulations that prohibited fraudulent business practices and intimidation of legitimate homesteaders. Federal investigation that resulted from the association's evidence gathering exposed corruption that extended beyond simple land speculation to include territorial officials who had been accepting bribes to ignore criminal activities or actively assist in forcing property transfers. The scandal that followed provided both justice for past victims and protection against future harassment. Rebecca's pregnancy with their second child, discovered during the height of their security crisis, added personal stakes to the broader struggle while providing hope for the future that motivated continued resistance against forces that threatened everything they valued. The knowledge that another baby would join their family reinforced their determination to build lasting security rather than accept temporary compromises. The territorial elections that followed the corruption scandal brought new officials committed to enforcing laws that protected homesteaders against organized fraud and intimidation. Sheriff Hartman's replacement by Deputy Marshal Catherine Pierce, a former cavalry officer with experience investigating territorial crime, provided law enforcement that actually supported rather than hindered legitimate property owners. As summer progressed toward harvest season, Rebecca and Jake contemplated the remarkable transformation of their circumstances from desperate survival to prosperous security. The challenges they had overcome together had strengthened rather than strained their relationship, proving that their partnership could handle success as effectively as it had managed crisis and hardship. 5 years had passed since that desperate autumn day when Rebecca Hayes first raised her bidding paddle at the Cedar Falls auction, and the Montana Territory of 1892 bore little resemblance to the harsh frontier that had tested every aspect of human endurance and determination. The Sullivan Homestead, as it was now known throughout the region, had become a landmark of prosperity and community leadership that drew visitors from across the territory, seeking to understand how two desperate strangers had built something so remarkable from circumstances that should have destroyed them. Both. Rebecca stood on the wraparound porch that Jake had added to their expanded home, watching their children play in the well-tended yard that had once been barren prairie. Sarah, now 5 years old, possessed the confident independence that marked children raised with abundant love and security, her dark hair catching sunlight as she chased her younger brother Thomas around the flower garden that had become Rebecca's pride and joy. 3-year-old Thomas displayed the fearless curiosity that reminded everyone of his father's military bearing, though his gentle treatment of the farm animals revealed sensitivity that came directly from Rebecca's nurturing influence. Their youngest, baby Margaret, slept peacefully in the hand-carved cradle that Jake had crafted during Rebecca's 3rd pregnancy, surrounded by the domesticated tranquility that had replaced the desperate isolation of their early years together. Homestead itself reflected the prosperity that systematic planning and coordinated labor could achieve when combined with the kind of partnership that made individual limitations irrelevant through mutual support. The original cabin had been expanded into a substantial farmhouse with proper bedrooms, a modern kitchen, and the amenities that successful agriculture could provide for families willing to invest their profits in long-term improvements rather than immediate luxuries. Jake emerged from the barn leading Thunder, whose advancing age had not diminished his dignity or his obvious contentment with the peaceful life that had replaced military service. The stallion's gray muzzle and slower gait marked the passage of time, but his alert bearing and continued responsiveness to Jake's commands demonstrated the enduring bond between horse and rider that had survived every challenge their partnership had faced. "The Patterson boy wants to learn cavalry riding techniques," Jake announced as he approached the porch, his reference to 16-year-old Michael Patterson, reflecting the way their community had grown and developed during the years since their Arrival. His father thinks military training might prepare him for territorial guard service, assuming the rumors about statehood prove accurate. The approaching transformation of Montana Territory into a full state represented changes that would affect every aspect of their lives, bringing new opportunities along with different challenges that required the same kind of careful planning and mutual cooperation that had enabled their personal success. Jake's involvement in territorial politics had grown naturally from his leadership role in the Cedar Valley Protective Association, while Rebecca's expertise in education and community organization had made her influential in planning for the schools and social institutions that statehood would require. Their marriage had evolved through the years into the kind of partnership that served as a model for other couples struggling to build successful relationships under frontier conditions. The desperate necessity that had brought them together had been replaced by genuine affection and mutual respect that deepened rather than diminished as they faced each new challenge. Together, the sexual intimacy that had developed gradually during their first winter had grown into the comfortable, physical closeness that marked couples whose relationship was based on trust and genuine compatibility rather than mere passion or convenience. Their 3 children were living proof of the love that had grown from the most unlikely circumstances, each pregnancy having been welcomed as expansion of the family they had chosen to create together. Rebecca's role as an unofficial community leader had developed through her natural ability to organize cooperative efforts and mediate disputes that might otherwise have divided their growing settlement. Her education and practical experience made her valuable for planning everything from school curricula to emergency response procedures, while her proven ability to handle crisis situations gave her authority that transcended traditional gender limitations. Jake's military background had proven invaluable, not just for their personal security, but for the broader community development that required leadership capable of coordinating complex projects across multiple families and interests. His election as the first mayor of what would soon become the incorporated town of Cedar Valley reflected the respect he had earned through demonstrated competence and genuine concern for collective welfare. The Cedar Valley Protective Association had evolved beyond its original security functions to become the foundation for local government that would be necessary when territorial administration was replaced by state-level organization. The cooperative agreements that had enabled defense against criminal threats provided frameworks for managing water rights, coordinating agricultural activities, and planning the infrastructure development that growing population would require. Their economic success had enabled investments in community improvements that benefited everyone while establishing their family's long-term security. The general store that Rebecca managed provided essential services while generating income that supplemented their agricultural earnings. Jake's freight and transportation business utilized his expertise with horses and logistics to serve a customer base that extended far beyond their immediate neighborhood. The school that they had helped establish served children from throughout the region, with Rebecca providing instruction in literature and mathematics, while Jake taught practical skills that included basic veterinary care, equipment maintenance, and the business principles that successful homesteading required. Their educational approach emphasized both academic learning and practical competence that would enable students to succeed regardless of whether they chose farming, business, or professional careers. Thunder's offspring had become sought-after breeding stock throughout the territory, their superior intelligence and training capabilities reflecting the quality of their military lineage. Jake's horse breeding program provided both economic benefits and personal satisfaction as he developed bloodlines that combined Thunder's best characteristics with the hardiness and adaptability that frontier conditions demanded. Their relationships with their original neighbors had strengthened through years of mutual assistance and shared challenges that had tested everyone's character and capabilities. John and Mary Patterson had become family friends whose children grew up alongside the Sullivan offspring. while the community network that had formed around their initial cooperation had expanded to include dozens of families whose prosperity reflected collective effort and mutual support. Rebecca's second book, A Comprehensive Guide to Frontier Medicine and Childcare, had been published by a territorial printing company and distributed throughout the western states. Her first book, documenting their experiences during the early years of their partnership, had become required reading for families considering homestead life in territories where isolation and harsh conditions made survival dependent on preparation and cooperation. Jake's involvement in territorial military affairs had led to his appointment as colonel in the Montana Territorial Guard, a position that utilized his cavalry experience while providing additional income and social standing that enhanced their family's security and influence. His recommendations had influenced territorial policy regarding veteran settlement assistance and the development of transportation infrastructure that served both civilian and military needs. The church that they had helped establish served as the social center for a community whose growth reflected the success of cooperative development rather than individual competition. Rebecca's involvement in organizing social activities and charitable efforts had made her influential in creating the kind of community culture that attracted stable families and discouraged the transient troublemakers who could disrupt frontier settlements. Their children's education reflected both parents' determination to provide opportunities that neither had enjoyed during their own youth. Sarah's obvious intelligence and leadership abilities suggested potential for advanced education that might take her to territorial colleges or even Eastern universities, while Thomas's mechanical aptitude indicated talents that could be developed through engineering or technical training that the growing territory would increasingly need. The legacy they were building extended beyond their immediate family to include the community institutions and cooperative relationships that would enable future generations to prosper in circumstances far more secure than those that had tested the founders' determination. Their success demonstrated that love and partnership could triumph over any obstacle when backed by competence, commitment, and willingness to sacrifice individual comfort for collective welfare. As evening approached and the children gathered for supper, Rebecca and Jake reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought them from desperate strangers at an auction to respected community leaders whose partnership had become legendary throughout the territory. Their story was told and retold as an example of how courage and cooperation could overcome seemingly impossible challenges when people were willing to trust each other completely. The auction that had seemed like Rebecca's last desperate gamble had instead become the foundation for a love story that proved how quickly life could change when the right people found each other under the right circumstances. Her purchase of an injured cowboy and his horse for the price of good cattle had resulted in acquisitions far more valuable than any amount of money could have bought. Looking back, they understood that their individual desperation had been necessary preparation for the partnership that neither could have achieved alone. Rebecca's determination to survive despite overwhelming odds had been perfectly matched by Jake's military discipline and protective instincts, creating a combination of strengths that enabled them to build something far greater than either had dared to imagine. During their darkest hours, their children would grow up in a world their parents had helped create through stubborn refusal to accept defeat when circumstances seemed impossible. The Montana that Sarah, Thomas, and Margaret would inherit would be safer, more prosperous, and more civilized than the harsh territory that had tested their parents' courage and determination beyond reasonable limits. The homestead that had once seemed like a trap threatening to destroy a desperate widow had become the foundation for a dynasty whose influence would extend far beyond agricultural success to include community leadership and social development that would benefit generations yet unborn. Their love story had become a legacy that demonstrated how much could be achieved when two people committed themselves completely to each other's welfare and to building something lasting together. As stars appeared in the Montana Sky that had witnessed their struggle in triumph. Rebecca and Jake Sullivan contemplated their future with the confidence of people who had proven that love could overcome any obstacle, that partnership could achieve miracles, and that sometimes the most desperate gambles produce the most extraordinary results when backed by courage, competence, and complete commitment to each other's happiness and success. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.